Welcome to this panel discussion on hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is a topic which is being discussed in the course on epistemology. We have several courses in the BA and MA programs of study, and one of the most important course is epistemology, which is basically theory of knowledge. In our panel discussion today, we have two experts. One is Professor Keith D'Souza, who is a professor of philosophy. He has a PhD from Marquette University in USA. His PhD is in hermeneutics. I am also pleased to introduce Professor Ivo Coelho, who is also an expert on hermeneutics. He has a PhD in philosophy, again on the same subject of hermeneutics, Gregorian University in Rome. Now, to begin with, I would like Professor Keith D'Souza to define and describe this technical word hermeneutics.
As you rightly say, it is a technical word, hermeneutics. It comes from a Greek word, hermenoin. Hermenoin itself comes from the word Hermes. Now, Hermes was the name of a Greek god, and the responsibility of that Greek god was to translate or to make understandable the language of the gods to human beings, because the language of the gods is very dense, very opaque, very difficult to understand. That is why even today, if you have a sacred text, you want an expert, a pandit or a scholar to interpret, to break the meaning of that text. Now, what is the definition, a simple definition of hermeneutics? It is the theory of interpretation. Simple definition, the theory of interpretation. If you want to make it more specific, the theory of the interpretation of texts, because hermeneutics deals with texts in a very narrow, specific sense. Now, if you want a more technical definition, it is a study of the operations of the understanding as they are applied to the interpretation of texts. We use the operations of understanding for different things. Suppose a historian is looking at the past, he is understanding the past and also therefore creating a text from that past based on his or her understanding. A scientist is looking at reality, different aspects of reality, and is using understanding to analyze reality, to process reality, to come out with theories about reality. So, when understanding or the operations, what goes on in our mind when we understand, when it is being used to look at text specifically, narrow sense, then hermeneutics is involved. In a broad sense, you can expand hermeneutics to include any aspect of reality that can be looked upon like a text. Now, what are the aspects of reality that can be looked upon like a text? Your body, for example. Suppose I am looking at you right now, Professor Thomas. You seem to be a very relaxed man, you seem to be an honest man. I am making an interpretation. Right. If I am meeting you for the first time, and if I don't know you, still we do make interpretations. We say, I like this person, I don't like this person. We are making. When we are judging human action, that can be made into a text. And if you look at psychology, sociology, anthropology, these are human sciences, social sciences, the softer sciences, which are making judgments about human actions, about human behavior. So, in some sense, hermeneutics, in a narrow sense, it is used for the interpretation of texts. In a broad sense, it is used for the interpretation of any aspect of reality that can be considered to be a text. So, that is what hermeneutics is. The theory of the interpretation of texts.
Thank you. Professor Ivo Coelho, you are a professor in Divyadan in Nasik, and you are teaching students of philosophy. Now, we are living in a fast changing society with a lot of social changes taking place, and along with that, lot of new issues are coming up, which is also forcing university students, even school education also is facing a kind of a challenge in introducing new topics into the curriculum. And given that kind of a scenario where we have plenty to be taught, what is the importance of or why should somebody take the pain of learning hermeneutics?
Yeah, it's a good question, Professor Thomas. Why add one more course to an already crowded syllabus? But the fact is that all through life, as Professor D'Souza has already begun saying, in almost all aspects of life we have to interpret. We are actually interpreting. I think hermeneutics only points our attention to something that is already happening, and perhaps it is making us aware of our own contribution to understanding what seems to be just bare plain fact. Let us say, when I see a person here in the city of Delhi, I immediately ask myself, is this person a North Indian? Is this person a South Indian? And if I am a South Indian, I will understand a North Indian in one particular way. What am I doing there? I am reading person through a certain prejudice, a certain bias, or a certain understanding that I already have beforehand. I am interpreting that reality which I see. Or take something very simple like physical gestures. A Westerner, an Italian for example, when he meets or she meets another person, they will immediately give a warm embrace. There is physical contact. But if a person like that comes to India and tries to do the same thing, that gesture may be misinterpreted as over familiarity. Yeah. So there is here again a question of a reality that is being seen differently, interpreted differently. So I mean, there are other very common examples like religion, for example. We may both be speaking English, we may both be using the word God, but can I assume that when I say God, I mean the same thing as when you say God? There is a gap there, and hermeneutics is the discipline that points out to that gap and makes us alert before presuming that we understand another person.
Well, Professor D'Souza, would you like to add on to what Professor Koile has explained to us about
I can give some very simple examples. If you, as I all go to a doctor, the doctor interprets and judges what is wrong. Sometimes we are may not be happy with that interpretation, with that opinion, and especially if it is a serious disease like cancer. And then we say, let us take a second opinion. So what are we doing? We are actually going from one interpretation to the other, and finally we will have to take a judgment about what course of action to take. And I've already mentioned about history, how history is an interpretation of the past, and sometimes there are tricky questions that can be raised about that. Am I free to interpret the past, or am I accountable to a larger community when I interpret the past? There are very serious epistemological questions. Hermeneutics is different from epistemology in this sense. Epistemology deals with truth, what is true. Hermeneutics deals with meaning, what is meaningful. And there is a difference between these two disciplines. Even though epistemology would like to swallow up and embrace hermeneutics, hermeneutics would like to keep its distance and say that at the level of meaning, one interpretation may be different from the other, and yet both may be meaningful.
Okay. So basically hermeneutics means it is interpretation of text. If so, Professor Koile, can you tell us what kind of or types of or categories of text which needs more interpretation, the kind of text that you would consider?
Yes, I think there are texts that need little or no interpretation, and there are texts that need a lot of interpretation. Take for example a text of mathematics. If I am not familiar with mathematics, that text might not mean anything to me, but it is not really a matter of interpretation according to me. It is a matter of learning the concepts that are necessary, the theorems that are necessary, so that I might be able to understand that text. Or let's say a text also of physical science. There again, some people will understand that text, some people will not, but it depends more on their background knowledge, on their ability to read that text. The scientific and mathematical texts, they tend to have a single meaning. In fact, we would say it is an attributed meaning, a constructed meaning, and that meaning, since we have given that meaning to it, it remains, it can be assumed to be universal. The problem is there are many other areas of life which have meanings which vary with culture, with time and with place. That is when the problem of interpretation comes in a major way. What would those areas be? Traditionally, I think one major area has been religion. So religious texts have probably been at the root of this whole art of interpretation, because they have given rise to many meanings, and there have been texts which are difficult to understand, that need to be therefore explained well. Another area is law, and law is a slightly different area. There may be a legal system and the laws may be very clear, and yet that law has to be interpreted, applied to a particular situation, which is what a court of law is doing. The lawyers, the judge ultimately has the task of arriving at an application of a particular law or set of laws to a concrete situation. So that is another big area of interpretation. And a third area traditionally is the whole area of literature. And I would add also art. But let's stick to literature, prose, poetry, or whatever it may be. There, of course, you have varieties of meanings that we can derive. And perhaps here, the theory that there are as many meanings as interpreters probably is most valid. A work of art reveals itself anew and differently each time somebody looks at it or someone different looks at it. So I would say these were the three major areas in which interpretation played a large role.
Now, if so, how did this concept of hermeneutics develop as a field of study? What is its history?
Yeah, as I was saying, probably the problem started with the religious texts. Okay. In India, we have the Astika darshanas, the darshanas that believe in God and in the established texts. We have the Nastik darshanas like Buddhism and Jainism. I think both these major areas had problems of text interpretation. Just to remain with the Astik darshanas themselves, we have the great school of the Purva Mimamsa. Mimamsa means interpretation, and they took the Vedic texts basically and they tried to find out what they meant. But they had one focus, assumption perhaps, and that is that the texts were meant to guide ritual action. And they had that focus, and according to that they built up their system of interpretation. The Uttara Mimamsa, the Mimamsa that came after the school, is more popularly known as Vedanta. That had quite a different focus. Shankaracharya, for example, would say the primary purpose of the Vedas and the Vedanta is to teach the way to liberation. And so he gave focus or consideration not to the ritual texts, but to the texts that spoke about Brahman, the great sentences, the Mahavakyas. So that is again an option that he made, and according to that he developed his theory of interpretation. In the West, I would say also maybe the history of interpretation started because of religious texts. In all religion, we have texts that become a little embarrassing at some times. In the Bible, for example, God is spoken as having a body, God is spoken as being angry, and a Jewish person called Philo of Alexandria proposed that some of these texts need to be understood in their deeper meaning, and he proposed a theory called allegory, and it was taken up by a Christian theologian called Origen, who used also the same method of allegory. He called it typology. But it was basically the same problem. There were problems with the text. It didn't quite open itself up, and hermeneutics was concerned to make this meaning more evident or give it its deeper meaning. Perhaps I could ask Professor D'Souza to complement this if he would like to.
I think hermeneutics as a philosophical discipline really came into its own light in the West in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, with a figure who might be considered to be the father of contemporary hermeneutics, that is Friedrich Schleiermacher. Now Swayam's great insight was to take these three areas of text interpretation, that is scripture, law and literature, these three regions of interpretation, and to make interpretation not a specific or regional discipline but a universal discipline in which understanding is applied in general, whether to these disciplines or any other discipline. That was his great insight, his great contribution. So you can say with Swayam, hermeneutics became an independent philosophical discipline in its own right. In contemporary times, certainly he is could be considered to be the father of contemporary hermeneutics. He paid importance to two aspects. One is called the grammatical and one is the psychological in the construction of texts. Suppose I am reading a text 200 years later. Grammatical means I am looking at the context, the grammar, the form, the structure, the language, the culture, the history, whatever of that time, the external objective factors. Now, why did he pay attention to the psychological, to the personal, private, divinatory, divinely inspired almost? For two reasons. One is because he belonged to a school called Romanticism, which was a reaction to the Enlightenment. Western Enlightenment gave a lot of importance to reason. Romanticism opposed that and gave importance to feeling. So he gave importance to the feeling associated with the construction of a text. Another reason was, suppose we give importance to those external objective structures, it still might be possible for 10 people interpreting an old text to come up with 10 different interpretations. How to judge which is the most important interpretation? So that is why he said, the interpreter who not only explains grammatically but also is able to understand the author better than the author understood himself or herself, comes up with the best interpretation. That is interesting. In hermeneutics, there is a controversy between those people who say we must know the intention of the author, the mind of the author. Other people, that means we must look to the backward of the text, behind. Other people are looking to the forward of the text. Never mind what the author had in his or her mind. Let us see whether this text makes sense for us today. Sometimes we do not know who the author of the text is. So for many reasons, contemporary thinkers tend to pay more importance to the forward of the text. Anyway, Swayam made his contribution. Dilthey was a follower who came a little later, and he made a very famous distinction between explanation and understanding. Explanation, he said, belong to the realm of the natural sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, because they look at reality in a very static, fixed way, and so they can explain because that reality doesn't change, or if it changes according to certain natural laws. Whereas human behavior is unpredictable little bit, or to some quite a large extent. We cannot explain so much but understand. Now he wanted to raise interpretation, especially history. History is an interpretation. Why shouldn't history be like physics? That was his concern. Of course, it is not very easy, and so he was not very successful, but he brought about this distinction between explanation and understanding. And even in the later theorists, there will be that struggle. Should we pay more importance to understanding or should we pay more importance to explanation? Another concept he brought in was Erlebnis or living experience. He was one of those thinkers who said that if you have to understand a text, you have to understand the historical context in which that text has been composed. And that is that is an important contribution. Heidegger, who came later, he gave importance to being, the being of the interpreter. The interpreter lives in time. The interpreter lives in a certain context, in a certain culture, in a certain situation. And most of the time, our consciousness is only at the very, it's like the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg. But below that, there is a lot of he will not use a psychological understanding, he will use a philosophical understanding. There is a force structure of understanding. So that we cannot escape from, a force structure of understanding. That gives us a sense of home, our language, culture, etc. So he contributed ontological hermeneutics. Ontos is a Greek word for being. So Swayam was a hermeneut of the text, and he universalized hermeneutics, made it a general discipline. Dilthey gave importance to history. Heidegger gave importance to being, ontos. And the next one is Gadamer, a disciple of Heidegger who died only a few years ago. He gave importance to tradition. So what Heidegger called being or force structure, Gadamer simply said that is our tradition. Now whether we like it or not, we belong to a certain tradition, And that tradition creates certain prejudices in our mind, prejudgments, not understood in a negative way, prejudice. Again, Gadamer is against that enlightenment spirit which says that we must be objective. He says it is not possible to be objective, because one cannot step outside one's own shadow. That shadow is the tradition. So, so what happens in understanding a text is that the text has its own horizon of meaning. I have my horizon of meaning. And when I read a text, there is a fusion of horizons. When there is that fusion, the confusion goes away. There is no more confusion because there is a fusion of horizons. So, all these concepts of tradition, prejudice, fusion of horizons is important for Gadamer. And maybe one of the greatest, the latest, if not the greatest, the latest hermeneutical theorist is Paul Ricoeur. He died also a few years ago. He, in a sense, took the best of all these thinkers. And Gadamer did not like to use method because he was against enlightenment reason. Whereas Ricoeur says, if you want to understand a text, you've got to use method to understand it. Different methods for different texts, depending on the text that one is studying. For Ricoeur, he gave importance to the text. Why? Suppose we had no text of the past, we would not have access to the past. Now, we may not have access to the events of the past, but we have access to the meanings of the past. The event disappears. Some events are recorded in those texts. So, the text is an attempt to preserve the meaning of the event. Now, what happens is, when people are reading it many years, many centuries later, there is a surplus of meaning. I cannot say my interpretation is the best and nobody else can interpret better than me. Why cannot I say this? Because the very next day I myself may come up with a better interpretation. Especially literary texts are very important from that point of view. Ricoeur went back to Schleiermacher's focus on text as the focus of hermeneutics, but he himself soon considered actions to be text, human action. And once you consider not only text but human actions, anything that is understandable of human action to be a text, then you are also saying that all social sciences are structured interpretations. And even in the natural sciences today, many scientists would accept that we come out with rival theories, and the theory that sort of wins the contest goes on as an accepted theory till another better theory comes along. So, the theory helps us to interpret the data or the reality. So, these are the main thinkers: Schleiermacher, Dilthey, Heidegger, Gadamer, Ricoeur. These 5 thinkers in contemporary hermeneutics, really each one of them has something very significant to contribute, and each one of them in their own way have enriched this field of hermeneutics.
So, basically we are, you would like
I would just like to add one point to what Professor D'Souza has said, and that is something that was very enlightening for me. The realization that history and tradition is not just something that I have. Gadamer said it is something that I am.
Okay.
It is me, so that inevitably when I interpret, it is influencing me. So there is a very deep sense in which I cannot set aside this history because I want to. It has to be perhaps examined and appropriated, made my own, so that it does not become something that hampers rather than allows me to understand things better. So that is something that I find extremely enlightening in the contribution made by Heidegger and Gadamer.
Well, we are talking about the theory of interpretation, and from this kind of discussion that we had now, it emerges that there are a lot of thinkers who have contributed to this theory of interpretation. Now, has it evolved as a full-fledged discipline anywhere in the world? And if so, where do we stand as far as India is concerned?
As Professor Coelho has said, there is a rich tradition, an ancient tradition also of interpretation. We, at least I, have been focusing mostly on philosophy on hermeneutics as a technical discipline in the Western tradition, and it has been enunciated at least and articulated in a very specialized manner over the past 200 to 250 years. Though, of course, there have been earlier interpretations. Those interpretations, as he pointed out, had to do mainly with religious texts, legal texts, literary texts. But interpretation involving understanding as such, that has come into its own, mainly in the last 2 to 250 years, and the thinkers that we have been focusing on are mainly French and German thinkers. Indian interpretation also, of course, is very rich and very strong, but takes especially sacred texts and religious texts into account. Would you agree with?
Yes, I think. My small addition would be that in Heidegger, but more especially in his disciple Gadamer, there would be a tendency to make hermeneutics into a discipline by itself. These people are not so much concerned about interpreting texts or even other realities concerned at texts. Whereas perhaps with people like Ricoeur, there is still a focus on, let us see how we understand texts and what are the conditions for that understanding, and can we arrive at some sort of agreement on these understandings. So there is this little dialectic or play between two tendencies in Western hermeneutics. In India, these are studied, but probably we are still with that clear focus on textual interpretation and a little beyond that.
Well, Professor D'Souza and Professor Ivo, we had a very fruitful and interesting discussion on hermeneutics, which is otherwise what we call theory of interpretation. Definitely this is an important topic and important chapter in our program of study in philosophy, both in BA philosophy as well as MA philosophy. I am sure this discussion is definitely going to throw a lot of light on the topic and make it more interesting for our students, and we shall definitely look forward to having more such interactions with our students in future. Thank you very much for coming to your studios and sharing your views and really your own thoughtful interventions on various aspects which we described or discussed today. Thank you.